Okay, so welcome to today's webinar in regards to employer duty of care and redundancies. So today's webinar is in conjunction with HRLocker as well as GHR Consulting. So we're delighted to have Rory Guckian with us today, who will go through, the employee's duty of care and redundancies specifically in today's environment. So Rory, delighted to have you with us today. If you'd like to give us a quick introduction to yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Christelle, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rory Guckian. I'm based here in Galway City. I have a HR and recruitment consultancy. I have about 15 years HR management experience, and I'm very honoured to be asked to give today's webinar. We're going to discuss the employer duty of care and redundancies, as Christelle said, and hopefully you'll all find some useful information included in it. So, Christelle, if you want to start, we'll
great. Just one thing. So just before Rory starts, there is a Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen where you can ask as many questions as you like. And Rory and Adam will be delighted to go through any questions and that you have specifically in regards to the webinar. So if you have any questions throughout, we are monitoring the Q&A section. So make sure you put in the questions there and we'll definitely get to them at the end. So over to you, Rory.
All right. Thanks very much. So just to start, we'll have a look at the agenda, just what today's webinar is going to focus on. So we'll start with the scope of the duty of care. So what the employer's duties are what the employer's duties are under the duty of care. We'll talk a bit about the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005, and again what the employer's duties are to protect their employees under this act. We'll have a look at the Health and Safety Authority and where they figure in the employment workplace. An important area to focus on as well as the bullying, harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace, because employers have a duty of care to their employees to make sure it's a workplace that's free from bullying and harassment, and what the implications are for employers who don't fulfill their duty of care to their employees. And the second half of the webinar, we'll look at redundancies, in particular as employees start returning to work. The reality is a lot of employers are going to face potential redundancies. We're going to look at what the redundancy legislation is and look at some recent changes that came about as a result of the COVID pandemic. We'll look at the rules to follow for employers and how they can minimise their risk. And finally, we'll have a look at if employers can't afford to pay redundancy, what the steps are for them to proceed. Okay, so on our first slide here, we're going to look at the duty of care. So the key points really for an employer's duty of care: an employer owes a duty of care to their employees, and that in a nutshell is, for an employer, it's what a reasonable and prudent employer would have done in the circumstances. I suppose the key thing to note about the duty of care is there's no obligation on employers to warn of obvious risks. So the reality is you're looking for your employees to take whatever precautions they can within reason to mitigate any risk to them or to other employees within the workplace. For an employee to succeed in a claim of negligence, they must prove how and why the employer was in breach of their duty of care. But again, it's reasonable care is what is required of the employer. An argument that an employer was guilty by omission will be closely scrutinised. It's easy to look at these things with the benefit of hindsight. I suppose this really, we're looking at it from a COVID point of view. So an example would be an employer who would be maybe liable if they knowingly let a person who had COVID symptoms, or for example had gone for a test and was still displaying the symptoms, and still force them back into the workplace, which they would, obviously they run the risk of potentially infecting other employees. And that would be an example where an employer would fail their duty of care. The opposite side of that argument would be where an employer has the correct processes and procedures in place, where if somebody shows signs of the coronavirus, what those steps are, including not returning to the workplace for 2 weeks, notifying other members of staff, and doing some having contact tracing for people within the workplace, so you can contact people to let them know that there had been a potential COVID case within the workplace. Just on to the next slide there. So the scope of the duty of care really can be assessed under 4 headings. Okay, so the first of these is the provision of competent staff. So employers really need to show, again, we're talking worst case scenario here, if a case was taken against them, an employer would need to show that they were aware of staff incompetence. So this would also be linked to inadequate supervision of employees. But again, it's the provision of a safe place of work is probably the most important of the 4 points. I mean, the employer's obligation is not to make accidents impossible, but just to make sure that they do everything under their control to ensure that they don't happen within reason. The third point here, the provision of a proper equipment. So again, the employers have the duty to provide the proper equipment, but again, if they provide a standard tool that turns out to have a defect, there's they're not going to be liable for that, because again, it was reasonable that they thought that the tool they provided was of good quality. And finally, the provision of a safe system of work. So again, it has to be as safe as reasonably possible within the circumstances, and this will depend on the particular job. So we can move on to the next slide there, Christelle, thank you. So an employer's duties to protect their employees. So the Health and Safety Act 2005 basically says employers should carry out a risk assessment to identify the risks of a coronavirus outbreak at work and implement steps to minimise that risk. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about risk assessments in a little short while, but employers need to be aware they could still face serious sanctions for failure to comply with their obligations under the 2005 Act. I mean, the current pandemic really is unprecedented, so it's difficult to anticipate how courts will apply common law with regards these things until I suppose there are some actual cases brought regarding the COVID-19 cases. Enforcement notices can be served by the Health and Safety Authority to deal with failures by employers to comply with the 2005 Act. You're seeing a lot of that now around hospitality, around bars and restaurants in particular, in the newspapers, where the HSA have the authority to close premises down that aren't complying with the Act. So the risk assessments these are very important to workplaces as employees start returning to work. I mean, the risk assessment can include distancing, cleaning, safety equipment, or health surveillance within the workplace. And the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005 requires employees to take reasonable measures and actually perform these risk assessments and provide the appropriate equipment to make sure the employees are safe within the workplace. So pop on to the next slide there. Okay, so the Health and Safety Authority. Okay, so the Health and Safety Authority, as I said, it has been in the papers a lot more recently maybe than before. Employers have a legal obligation to ensure the safety, health and welfare at work of their employees. And as I said, they should, if you're having employees return to the workplace now, you should be identifying the risks of a coronavirus outbreak at work and what steps the employer is going to implement to minimise that risk. You should really have a contingency plan in place within the business. So if there is a coronavirus outbreak, are you set up to maybe work from home and have everybody immediately start working from home? You should be reviewing your policies and procedures as well around this. The HSA has published guidance notes on the following issues to assist employers in complying with their obligations. So, I mean, there's 9 there. The ones which really would probably apply to most of the people on this webinar would be regarding display screen equipment, safety signs at places of work, maybe around COVID and the washing of hands and social distancing, maybe first aid as well, PPE in particular. The personal protective equipment is obviously going to be very important now, especially maybe within the hospitality sector, or where you have a lot of the people on this webinar obviously would have teachers in schools. So, what equipment do they need in place to protect their employees and the people actually coming to the schools as well. And the safety signs at work, I mean, this is a very easy step which employers can take which will, they're all available on the HSE website and the HSA website, and you get them printed off and put at the correct locations around the office. So there are some very easy practical steps which employers can take to protect their employees. So pop on to the next slide there. Thanks, Christelle.
Okay.
So one area which maybe gets overlooked a lot with the duty of care is regarding bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment within the workplace. So it's one of the employer's main duties to prevent improper conduct or behaviour, which includes bullying. An employer should have established procedures for dealing with complaints of bullying in the workplace and deal with such complaints immediately. And when you review a lot of the cases that go to court, a lot of the time the employer has ignored the issues that were occurring. And there could have been several issues, maybe taken individually, which weren't of, maybe you would say, well, he or she is overreacting. But if there's 10 or even 5 examples of similar type of behavior taken together, they would, often be very clearly add up to harassment or sexual harassment or bullying in the workplace. Ignoring complaints of bullying can leave the employer open to a possible claim. It's very advisable for an employer to have a grievance procedure to deal with complaints of bullying. If I'm dealing with any new clients, one of the first things I would check to have they a grievance policy and procedure, have they a disciplinary policy and procedure. I mean, they're vitally important in the workplace to deal with issues like this. The Employment Equality Acts 98 and 2004 place an obligation on employers to prevent harassment in the workplace. So it's not something you can turn a blind eye to. Often small issues of harassment, if they're not dealt with at the correct time, can turn into something much bigger, and a much bigger problem for the employer usually results. Under this Equality Act law as well, employers can be held liable before the Equality Tribunal and obliged to pay compensation if the employee is harassed for reason, gender, marital status, family status, sexual orientation, age, disability, race, religious belief, or membership of the traveller community. So employers really need to familiarise themselves with this legislation, but more importantly, have a robust grievance and disciplinary procedure in place and make sure that they deal with the issues as they occur. Now, just to finish up regarding the duty of care, it's the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005 is really where employers are going to be held liable under. They must ensure, as far as reasonably practical, that the safety, health and welfare at work of his or her employees, is looked after. There is a maximum fine of €3 million or up to 2 million or 2 years in jail. And directors, managers or officers within the business can be prosecuted personally if they're deemed not to have taken measures to mitigate the risk. So we've discussed really the 4 areas about mitigating risk, be it from training, the measures taking. There are some basic measures which companies can take as employees start returning to work around PPE, around protocol if somebody is diagnosed with the coronavirus. But again, a big one which employers should be looking at is really around the risk assessment and making sure that these are updated for employees to return to the workplace, and making sure that they're relevant to the risks which employees are going to be facing in the coming weeks as workplaces continue to reopen. Adam, I don't know, do you want to add a little something there regarding the duty of care to employees?
No, not really. A lot of it is to do with just purely common sense. But I think the documentation of the common sense is really important. So if people review these and they see things that should be sort of brought into the actual workplace, make sure that there's consultation around it. Make sure that you give your employees the opportunity to read, to go through stuff, and ideally sign or digitally sign it to a document in any way, shape or form. Most people in smaller organizations may have a lot of the duty of care in what I call an elongated contract, where you have your bullying and harassment, you have your any sexual discrimination, you have your grievance procedure could form part of your contract. while other companies who are probably a little bit bigger and have more time to dedicate to stuff like this, they might end up compiling an employee handbook, and this could be one part of the employee handbook. But no, other than that, it's everything is good there.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed last week really the communication. There are some really basic steps which employers can take to, you know, to reassure their employees. That's what this process is about. You're reassuring them they're returning to a safe place of work. So basic communication and letting them know what steps you're taking, and letting them know that you're taking it seriously, basically. Okay, so we're just going to have a short discussion regarding a short presentation regarding the redundancies as well. Unfortunately, as the wage subsidy scheme kind of comes to a close over the coming months at some stage, or certainly start to be reduced down, the reality is a lot of employers are going to find themselves in a position where they need to make some of their employees redundant. So just a definition really from the Redundancy Payment Acts of redundancy: the fact that the requirements of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind in a place where he or she was so employed have ceased or diminished, or are expected to cease or diminish. So it's a very legalistic way of saying there's no longer a requirement for the role. So just to be clear regarding what a collective redundancy versus a non-collective redundancy, a collective redundancy is one where maybe 5 people, if there's a staff of 20 to 50 employees and 5 of those are being made redundant, that would fall under a collective redundancy. Or if there's 50 to 100 employees and at least 10 people are being made redundant, the majority of redundancy claims really for SMEs would be non-collective. So that's really what we're going to speak about over the coming slides. I suppose we'll talk as well about making sure you stick with the fair process. I mean, there's no doubt there are many genuine redundancy situations. A lot of employers need to ensure that the redundancy process is fair and, as I said, carried out with due process. A lot of employers may try to use the COVID pandemic to say, well, I have a few employees who have been causing me trouble over the last few years, so actually this will be a good time to cut their jobs and hang on to the better employees. But that thinking has obviously its pitfalls as well, which I'm going to discuss and just explain how you can maybe minimize the risk to your business. Okay, so the redundancy legislation is the Redundancy Payments Act 67 to 2014. These provide a minimum entitlement to a redundancy payment for employees who have a set period of time with their employer. So employees are required to have been employed for 104 weeks, or 2 years basically, with their employer before they are eligible for a redundancy claim. Now, the claim is basically capped at a maximum of 600 euros per week. So even if an employee is earning 700 or 650 euros per week, the claim will be capped at 600 per week. So just to give you a very simplistic example, if an employee has been working with you for 2 years, they would get 2 weeks multiplied by a maximum of 600, which would be 1,200 euros multiplied by the number of years service, so 2. So you're looking at 2,400 euros, plus there's 1 week bonus on top of the payment. So you're looking at a payout of 3,000 euros in a case like that. If the employee has worked there for 10 years, you'd be looking at 1,200 euros multiplied by 10, so 12,000 euros with the 1 week on top, so 12,600 euros. In a situation where an employee has been laid off or put on short-time work, this means that their contract of employment is temporarily suspended. And I'm going to discuss in a moment just about some of the changes which were brought in as a result of the pandemic. There was some emergency legislation regarding redundancy, which is currently in place for another 3 weeks or so. When an employer gives notice of redundancies, employees are entitled to the full notice period. So if an employee is not required to work out their notice period, they're still entitled to be paid in lieu of the notice, which is their normal pay. When they get the redundancy pay, generally it is tax-free as well. So you just need to familiarize yourself with, especially if you've longer term employees and you're concerned that maybe you don't have a role for them going forward, you need to be aware that certainly people who've been with you for a longer term versus shorter term are going to be more expensive to your business to if you want to make them redundant. We'll pop on to the next slide there. Okay, so the redundancy legislation changes. Okay, so the Redundancy Payments Acts do provide for a mechanism where an employee can serve notice of redundancy if they've been laid off or put on short-time hours. So prior to the COVID kind of pandemic, if someone was laid off or put on short-term for 4 weeks or more, they could actually claim for redundancy, and the employer would then actually have 4 weeks to bring them back in on their full-time hours. And if they couldn't do that, the employee could basically claim redundancy for that. There was emergency measures brought in with the COVID pandemic, and the ability to serve notice on employers is temporarily suspended. That basically means an employee will not be able to claim redundancy during this emergency period if they're laid off or put on short-time work. Now, the emergency period has been further extended to the 10th of August 2020. It probably will be extended further, but it's one definitely to keep an eye on if you feel your business might be in a position where it has to make redundancies. So there's about another 3 weeks or so to go on that. But the reality is, for an awful lot of clients I deal with and for SMEs throughout the country, if that legislation isn't extended, a lot of businesses will not be able to afford to make those redundancy payments, and it will result in businesses closing down. Just want to discuss a little bit about layoff and short-time work, and I'm sure most of you know what this is already, but basically the layoff, most of them are coming to an end at the moment and people are returning to the workplace. A short time is where you might put them on a 2 or 3 day week. So I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that at this stage. Okay, so we'll have a look at the rules to follow. I mean, these are just 4 basic rules which employers can follow to kind of minimize the risks, and I'm going to discuss, I suppose, how to minimize those risks in the coming slides. So the first case, if you're looking at redundancy, look at the business rationale. So redundancy should only be used as a last resort. Employers must ensure to have a clear rationale for making certain positions redundant within the company. I mean, as I said, you can't just pick and choose which employees you want to hang on to and which ones you want to make redundant, because again, you're leaving yourself open to a claim of unfair selection and ultimately unfair dismissal. You should have a consultation process. Again, as I said, even if it's a small number of employees, you should engage with the employees for as long as possible. I mean, it reflects very badly on the business if you turn up on a Friday afternoon and give your employees 1 week's notice that their position is being made redundant. Generally speaking, you'd look to give at least 30 days notice before the employee's position is coming to an end. There would be a consultation period, which happens after you've made the kind of business case for it. And again, the employer should be engaging with employees at the earliest possible stage. There should be a fair selection of employees. It needs to be objective. It needs to be skill-based criteria, for example. Another one which employers use is the last in, first out model. So again, as long as it's seen to be fair and reasonable, rather than cherry picking which employees you want to basically get rid of or make redundant versus others who don't. I mean, redundancy really should be the last option. You should really maybe have looked at pay cuts. Do you want to do pay cuts across the board in the hope that you don't need to make 2 or 3 positions redundant? There are different options available to employers, and they need to make sure that whatever they do is act in good faith, because they'll leave themselves open to potentially being sued for unfair dismissal if an employee can kind of prove that the employer didn't look at any other option prior to redundancy. So really, it should be a last resort rather than the first thing they want to do. So just have a look at the next slide there. Okay, so how to minimize risk. Okay, so the selection of employees, as I said, is fair and objective. It needs to be justifiable, and the more you discuss it with the employee, the better. The process used to effect the redundancy should be transparent, reasonable, and in line with best practice and legal guidance. So you can't decide you're getting rid of John in the warehouse because he was the last in but yet, you know, in the office, you're going to use a skills-based analysis, you know, for keeping on certain employees. You need to make sure it's fair and reasonable. If it's last in, first out, it should be the same process across all of the faculties within the business. And as I said, engage in effective and meaningful consultation. Give the employee the opportunity to provide their input and suggest alternatives. You lose a lot of goodwill, and it will reflect badly on the company if, you know, you're given alternatives and they're all being dismissed without even, you know, being looked at, or maybe some costings done on them. You can pop onto the next one there. Okay, so how to minimize risk, continued. So the redundancies themselves need to be shown to be genuine and required for the business for operational reasons. Basically, there may be financial documentation that, you know, employers can provide. I mean, the key really, it boils down to, the key for the employer is, are they seen to be acting fairly and reasonably, and look at all of the different options before reaching the redundancy decision. The redundancy decision should be sound and capable of withstanding a claim of unfair dismissal. The business probably needs to say, can they demonstrate there are no suitable alternative positions within the organisation for those employees? There are no alternatives to redundancies, as I said, pay cuts, other cost-cutting measures within the business, maybe postponing some capital expenditure which you'd planned for this year or early next year. I would retain a clear paper trail during the redundancy process. All meetings should be clearly minuted. They should be documented, retained on file. Writing letters to the employee explaining, if you've had a meeting with them, have a letter confirming what was discussed at the meeting and outlining when the next meeting is and what the next stage of the process is. This is all good practice, rather than just having a verbal meeting and you know, you've no proof at the end of the day as to what was or wasn't discussed. Communication should be confirmed, as I said, and followed up by letter. An important thing to note as well, employees should be given the right to appeal. So if they are being made redundant, they should be given the right to appeal that decision. Again, there may be something that they can suggest that you hadn't thought of yourself. And, you know, it might be a thing that there actually is an alternative to making their position redundant. Again, if you don't give them the right of appeal, it reflects badly on the employer. You may be seen to be unreasonable, that you're not considering the alternatives which the employee is presenting to you. And just on the last slide regarding redundancies, I know it's a question which a lot of employers are facing at the moment, regarding if they can't afford to pay redundancy. So the process here is that they need to complete and submit an RP50 form online. And again, I have the link on the slides, which will be sent to you after the presentation. You're basically printing out a copy of the completed form, signed by the employee and the employer. You'll need a letter from either your solicitor or your accountant, basically stating you're unable to pay the redundancy lump sum. And you'll be stating this, you're accepting liability for 100% of the lump sum owing to the social insurance fund. I think this is really going to be a hot topic in the coming months. As I said, as the wage subsidy starts to come to an end, a lot of employers are going to have to start making people redundant, and there may not be alternatives other than that. And it'll just be interesting to see, you know, if employers are able to hang on to the majority of the staff. I think it's going to be a really hot topic over the coming months, so it's one you should definitely familiarise yourself with. That's really all I have on redundancy. Adam, I don't know if you have anything in particular you want to add regarding redundancies and the issues facing employers at the moment around that.
Yeah, a few things, I suppose. There's one really good site in terms of the calculation of redundancies. And it's actually quite easy to find, because if you actually just Google redundancy calculations Ireland, it comes up straight away, and it's actually from the revenue. There's a big long URL to it, so I can't exactly share that with you because it's
we can send it with the webinar at the end.
We'll send it with the webinar at the end. So it's welfare.ie /pages/secure/redundancy calculator.aspx. That's the first thing. It will really give you an idea and you're not giving anything to the revenue by doing this. It just, you pump in a load of stuff that they want, and you pump in sort of breaks in service and stuff like that, and you press calculator. That works really, really well. With the selection of redundancy, it's really, really important. It's probably the one area, if you're going to get sort of challenged on when you're doing redundancies, it will be around the selection. So the selection criteria, as Rory said, could be as simple as last in, first out, or it could be down to a very, very specific role. Now, please remember, people don't get made redundant. Basically, jobs get made redundant. So the important thing is that you don't implicate any individual in any way. So it's the job that's been made redundant, not the actual person, which is hugely important. The other thing that you might consider, if you're in a position to do it, before we launched HRLocker, as you probably know, we were a HR consultancy, and about 25% of our work was all around outplacement. So if you have some individuals who you want to look after a little bit better, or you want to build an outplacement program to help your staff that you're making redundant to get jobs, by all means, come back and talk to us at HRLocker. What we will do is, while we don't do the actual outplacement programs anymore, we would work with the likes of Rory and other people to drive those programs, and they can be as much as little as you want. But I suppose, having gone through the previous downturn in 2007, 8, and 9, we would have massive amount of expertise in this area, both to our partners and to ourselves. So if there is a requirement, we will more than likely build some sort of we'll build a system for whatever company is looking for it, in order to actually do that. So it's simple things like putting CVs together, but it's more importantly nowadays, and it's very topical, is around the mental health of the employees, because when a person gets made redundant, they go through the similar emotions as you would when somebody has actually somebody has died. So they go through the whole scenario of regret, right down to anger, and then right up to reconciliation as well. So that needs to be taken into consideration during that period of time, because nobody really knows what's going on in an individual's home place, and particularly with COVID-19, you don't know what sort of stresses are under. So I would really emphasize my favorite word of the last 6 months, which is empathy with the employees, if you are going to go down this route of redundancy. But other than that, no, it's all good.
Good. So we have a few questions here. So the first question is, an hourly paid teacher turned down the offer of online teaching because the pay on offer worked out less than the $350 COVID payment. Does he or she have the right to return to work ahead of a teacher who is hired to teach those online hours?
So what I'd say, I wouldn't say they've any more or less a right to work. If they're both permanent employees, they really both have the same rights. I mean, what I'd be saying, I'd be communicating all of these things with the teacher in question. And most of my clients I'm dealing with are having similar issues where people don't want to return to the workplace. What do? So again, you're putting this in writing to them. You're writing them a letter to say, here's the mitigation steps we've taken within the workplace. There's no reason basically for them not to return. And if they're putting in writing they don't want to return because they're making less money, I mean, in effect, they're null and voiding their contract of employment. I mean, as part of your contract of employment, you're supposed to make yourself available for the hours that you're due to work. So if you're not making yourself available for those hours, I would certainly be saying, I'd be giving the employee an ultimatum that, if they don't want to return to the workplace, you're assuming that they're terminating their employment, and I'd certainly be quite heavy with them if that they don't have a genuine reason. If somebody's saying they can't return to the workplace because they're scared of their kids or an elderly relative, that's a different situation from somebody who says, I don't want to return because I'm earning more money on the COVID payment. I mean, that's not a legitimate reason not to return to the workplace. Adam, I don't know if you have anything in addition you want to add to that.
Yeah, the one thing I would be a little bit worried about on that one is that so for instance, if a person was on short-term layoff and they were on a contract and they were on a certain payment on contract, just because you're changing them across from face-to-face to online training doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right as an employer to reduce their wages. So if you have made this as a, if you're in the office, you get paid X. If you do it online, you get paid Y. Then they may have an argument around it. If they obviously specifically say the COVID payment, it's a different ballgame. But if it's a situation where the employer has changed the rates of pay between the layoff and coming back to work, then you're talking about contract negotiations elements where you're actually trying to change their terms of employment, which actually could go down as constructive dismissal if they were to take a case. So you just have to be very, very careful that you're maintaining their terms and conditions and pay in accordance with their contract.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The next question is, can making permanent pay cuts be seen as an acceptable alternative to redundancies?
Yes, is the answer. Again, it's important to communicate it clearly and effectively, I suppose. Where employers let themselves down sometimes is they use an opportunity like this to implement pay cuts under the reasoning that, the business has substantially suffered, where the reality is maybe the business hasn't suffered at all. If they can prove, be it through their accounts or a solicitor's letter stating that their finances have suffered, and can document that, then they'd certainly be, it all comes down to what's fair and reasonable. Is the employer acting reasonably? And if the employer can show, these are our accounts, they dropped 30%, we therefore have to implement 20% or 25% pay cuts, and this has all been done with consultation with the employees, regular meetings, letters, clear communication. It would be a fair reason to implement pay cuts if it's reasonable, and if it's the reality of the situation, then it would be. I think an employee would have great difficulty in winning an unfair dismissal or a claim against the company, certainly if they could document that their finances had suffered greatly as a result of what's been happening.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Next question is quite an interesting one. So they're firing at you today, guys. For redundancy entitlement, if an employee was under 2 years service before COVID shutdown, are they entitled to redundancy if they're now on layoff and have come into 2 years service while on layoff?
Yeah, so their contract of employment still continues, even though they've been temporarily laid off. So their term of employment is still accruing. So the short answer is yes, they would, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the next question kind of goes into this: does a break in service affect the calculation of the redundancy?
A break in service, yes, but a temporary layoff like this wouldn't count as a break in service. Someone going on parental leave would count as a break in service. So when you're doing the calculations, if you'd have to factor that in, or someone going on unpaid leave, for example, for 3 or 6 months, you deduct that from the from the calculations as well.
But if somebody was put on for the last 2 months on short-term leave because of COVID, are they taking the 2 months out or leaving them in?
No, you're leaving them in. So if somebody was just coming up to their 2 years prior to the lockdown, this would have pushed them over, yeah. So they would be entitled to redundancy. Again,
that welfare.ie site that I've given you, it actually states on the site, it makes allowance for breaks in service, and it says only breaks in service in the 3 years prior to your employment end date are required for calculation purposes. So in other words, if that's the situation, it's breaks in service basically in the 3 years prior to the employment end date.
Okay. If you have 3 people in one team, all at the same level, started at the same time and doing similar jobs, but you can only keep one on, how can you prove your selection of 2 to be made redundant is fair?
Well, if you're not doing, if they start at the same time, you obviously can't do a last in, first out situation. So you need to do really a competency-based analysis or a skills-based analysis. So again, as long as it's fair and reasonable, you might need to break the role down into 5 or 6 different functions, for example, be it teaching, be it performance over the previous years, you know, how they get on with other staff. There's lots of different categories, and basically you're in effect, you're going to be scoring your 3 employees in a kind of fair and objective way. That's probably the only way. I mean, the reality is, if you pick the person you get on best with, but that person maybe has been the lower performer of the 3, but you decide to keep them on because you're good mates with them, again, you're leaving yourself wide open. If you have a fair and transparent process, that's probably the most important thing. Adam, I don't know if you have any particular experience with the kind of needs analysis, I suppose, for redundancy selection.
It depends on what the company have in place. If they've got like an RTR or real-time reviews or performance management, they can look at the performance of the employee. They can look at the various conversations they had with all the various employees if they're all documented. Other than that, it's very, very difficult. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but if there's a situation that you have 3 or 4 or 5 employees doing the same job, same length of time, you know, they might have different qualifications or the same qualifications. If everything is the same, the only way around it is by putting all their names into a hat and pulling them out. And that's seen as a fair way of actually deciding at that stage. It's not fair, but that's life, I suppose.
Okay, Chris.
Perfect. Sorry. Yeah, perfect. So that comes to the end of our questions. So thank you very much, both Rory and Adam. So again, if anybody would like to get in touch with either Rory or Adam, the details will be in the webinar. The best place to look at HRLocker. So we do a 14-day trial if anybody would like to go on and take on to trial there, and then and Rory's information is there as well. Guys, I just have one last question before everybody goes, if that's okay. So I'll just read the question out here. If just got in time. If someone is on sick leave for 2 years pre-COVID, is that 2 years counted towards redundancy?
My understanding is it's usually the first 15 months of the sick leave would count towards it, especially for the accrual of their bank holidays and annual leave and stuff. I'd need to double check that. Adam, I don't know if you're aware of that, but my understanding is the first 15 months. But I mean, if you have someone on sick leave for 2 years, this is actually becoming quite a big problem for a lot of employers, because employees are accruing their annual leave during, you know, the first 15 months. So at the end of even a 12-month period, an employee on sick term leave or sick leave has basically accrued their 4 weeks annual leave and their 9 bank holidays, so about 6 weeks wages. My advice to that employer would be probably to get in touch to you know, so I can learn about the specifics of the case. But again, you should really be bringing it to a head rather than letting it drag on for 2 years. I mean, what I'd normally say to employers is once it goes beyond a month, that would classify as long-term leave, and then you would be kind of saying, we want to send you to a company appointed doctor, and basically following your sickness absence process, rather than just maybe letting it develop into a situation where the employee has been out sick for that length of time.
Yeah, it's about the engaging the employee at this stage. And I think this is probably a follow-on to it. Is sick leave considered a break in service?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely, I wish, so again, Rory's details are there if anybody has a specific case like that, where I would say at this stage it needs to probably be addressed and start engaging with the employee. So again, look, a copy of the webinar will go out to everybody, along with all the questions, and all our contact details will be there. So thank you very much for everybody who attended the webinar series, and we're delighted with all the participation. And again, if anybody has any questions, we're always here to help. So take care, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.